So last time, a couple weeks ago, we covered the various heresies that rose up in the early days of the church, and it's been funny. I've seen a number of examples of those in the last week or two. I just heard people say things, kind of bring those back up. But that was, we were talking about kind of a period of peace. Yes? Oh yeah, they should be on the copier if it's printed correctly. That we talked about a period of relative peace. Around 200, and that's why we took a side note to talk about these heresies. So now we'll pick up in roughly 249 with what's called the Decian persecution, and that's after a guy named Decius. Decius was, they had all these Roman emperors coming through, and they all had, just like presidents, different priorities. Some were good guys, some were bad guys, some were, they excelled in different areas. And persecution kind of did the same thing. It came in waves. It wasn't a constant thing necessarily. It was kind of underlying a lot of the time, but there were these waves where it increased. Decius was a huge wave. And actually, there's the guys, some of the worst guys, their names start with D, it's easy to remember them. Decius was the first of the three. So, persecution, the idea was, this is this weird thing going on that we want to knock out and try and clean up this confusion, this uprising. But persecution had the wrong effect. It didn't have the desired effect anyway. It actually strengthened the church. And what Decius found is, well, we'll see what happened in strengthening the church. Tertullian, who I mentioned before, he had a saying that I think is fantastic, that actually is held true. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So his idea is the more that people are persecuted, and especially killed, it doesn't shut things down, it got people revved up. They see what's really important, and the early Christians already believed this was important. That's why they wouldn't recant, that's why they would die for their faith, they'd be beaten for it. But not only did they do that, but when they saw others doing that, that was something, and dying for their faith, that was something that invigorated them. So even though this persecution was meant to try and end this new upstart religion, it had the opposite effect. So when Decius comes on the scene, he claims his motivation was the safety of the empire. He wants to save the empire because we've got these weird views, and I mentioned that you would have, we've got a drought. What's the reason for the drought? It's probably somebody is not sacrificing to the gods or whatever. Any problem that comes up, we just lost this battle against some invading force, it's probably because we've got a growing number of our citizenry who is not sacrificing to the gods, so we're not all on the same page. So Decius decided, in the interest of the safety of the empire, all Christians, well, all Roman citizens, but this is a law specifically made for Christians, all must not only sacrifice before the local officials, but that they produce evidence that they had done so. So that was a new thing with Decius. If you flip to that, I think it's slide 7 of that one I showed you after the coin picture. So what he said is, you have to produce a libellus. A libellus was kind of like a driver's license or a certificate of some sort. What this says, I think I might have put something on the handout. It translates this, because you probably don't know to read, this as well as I do. It says that I, so-and-so, state some official, hereby testify that this person has sacrificed according to Roman law before me, and this is their pass. It's their hall pass. You're walking around downtown, you want to do business, you want to, be a Roman citizen. You have to produce this libellus to stay out of trouble. If you don't produce one, then they'll say, okay, right now, you do the sacrifice right now. If you don't, now you're in trouble. So that's when you start getting persecuted. Side note, one view is that the mention of tribulation, or not just tribulation, but that you need a mark to buy and sell and all this kind of stuff, it describes the libellus very well. This is what had to happen during the Decian persecution. You had to produce this in order to function in society. So, if you didn't produce one, you're beaten or killed. So the immediate dilemma, if you're a Christian in the early church, remember I mentioned last time this catechesis process, where someone says, I want to be a Christian, I believe. Okay, belief, that's fantastic, but you don't know enough, because unless you came from Judaism, for the most part you're a Gentile probably, so you don't know that much about God or Christianity. So they went through a roughly 2-year process called catechesis. The people are called catechumens. They go through this process to learn all this information. Once you get to the point where you've learned it well enough that you can recite it essentially, then you're able to get baptized. So once you do that, now you're part of the church. Basically this baptism, you know, we talk about this, the importance of a public proclamation, and it's kind of fuzzy what that really means now. Then it was very clear. Being baptized means you now have a mark on your head. I mean, you are now targetable by the law, because you're someone that is you've made a public announcement, and you've been baptized, so everyone knows. There's no doubt when you say you're a Christian. It's not, yeah, I go to such and such a church sometimes. It was, no, I have made it very clear that before this point I was one thing, and after this point I'm another. Now the rules change. Now if you don't have labellus, you can be killed. So there's this church that's meeting in secret that is now, you know, they take their faith very seriously. So now their primary dilemma right off the bat is, do we comply with this or not? Do we go along with this and abandon our faith, or continue our faith and just do this to just, well, you know, whatever, when in Rome kind of thing, we'll get this, but we don't really mean it. What do you do? The secondary dilemma came after Decius. Decius was, he was emperor for 249, 251. So then what to do after Decius, or after Decius died in 251? Then what do we do with these they're called the lapsed. So the lapsed, I don't remember what pictures I made, so you can just guess. And they're, I'll talk about him in a minute, so that's fine. You can leave him up. Okay, the lapsed, people whose faith has lapsed. What these people were is people who were Christians, had gone through the whole catechesis and were baptized and were part of the church, but then after that got a labellus. Okay, so now Decius is dead. The persecution dies down. It's not quite as bad, if at all. So now the church is kind of coming out of hiding, and we can start meeting in public again, not in people's houses necessarily. Not at night or in hiding, whatever. It was a little more public. So now they started talking about, what do we do with these people that lapsed, that didn't stick it out with the church? Because some did, and some flew under the radar. Others were beaten or killed. So what do we do with the people who didn't, that decided to get a labellus and now want to come back into the church? What do we do with that? And we still deal with similar things today, not as cut and dried. It's not as public a thing, and it's not as serious a thing. We're not talking about getting killed, and we don't have to carry a certificate around. But still, somebody leaves the church for some reason. Maybe it's sin, maybe it's some kind of moral thing, maybe it's just, who knows, a number of reasons. And then they come back. Well, what do you do with that? Back then, it was a whole lot more black and white issue as far as them leaving and coming back. But as far as what to do with them, that was not as clear. I think one thing that's interesting with this, not that persecution's a bad thing, we don't want people killed or beaten, but at the same time, there's something I appreciate reading these early church fathers and about the early church. They took their faith very seriously. Where today, I think a lot of people's like, it's just a casual, I'm a Christian because my people in my neighborhood go to this church and that's what we do too. Okay, that's great, but there is a different clarity when there's this kind of purging process, that people take things much more seriously. So, when we got this issue of the lapse coming back in, there's several different options of what can be done with these people. And there are 3 primary views that rise to the top. The first one, a guy named Novatian, I don't think I got Novatian, that was Cyprian, and not a lot of photos. But Novatian was a priest in Rome, and he said, this is very clear, you make a decision when you're saved. You are making a decision for Christ. If you recant that, if you decide against that, if you leave him in some way, tough luck. I mean, that was your choice. You live with the consequences. That was Novatian's view. You have ceded your right to be called a Christian. So, and really, this is something that is too severe to merely repent for. You can't just say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done it. I don't mean to make light of it, but just there's no penance possible to cover this. Now, it sounds like, based on some things you read, that there was a possibility to re-enter the whole catechesis process, to start over at the beginning and be a catechumen, go through the whole process and then get rebaptized. That's kind of fuzzy. It sounds like they probably tended more towards the no, you're out of luck. You gave up your right to be a Christian. So that was the hardline view by Novatian. The next view, yes you can, but with a process. This is not just easy, you don't just come in. This Pope Cornelius held this view. He disagreed very strongly with Novatian, and he favored a process whereby these lapsed people prove their contrition. They don't just come in and say, hey, we're back, the bad times are over, and I want to be a Christian again. It's not that easy. You have to prove your contrition, prove you're sorry, prove that you've changed. The term they used for this was penitents. These people were called penitents, and they got a special place in the back to sit. So if you're in that row back there, then the place of shame or whatever, which they want to point out these people have done something wrong, but they're in the process of coming back in. Novatian didn't like that idea, so Novatian declared himself the anti-pope. So this is it's maybe the first time where we had two popes at the same time. This happened a number of times. There was one time we had three. But there's two popes at the same time, both claiming that they are, have apostolic succession, and they are the leader of the Christian church, which is confusing when you have two. So this was called the Novatian Schism. This was the first giant church split over this issue, what to do with the lapsed. Cyprian, which is this next guy, he was bishop of Carthage. During this Decian persecution, like others we've talked about, this is going on, so he goes into hiding rather than, get a libellus or leaving the faith or being killed. He decides it doesn't serve me to be killed, and I'm certainly not going to renounce my faith, so it would be good for me, because he led a large church, to go into hiding. He lived in a cave for quite a while, and they brought correspondence to him from between him and others. So he lived in hiding, so he could support the church and lead the church from a distance, and he would write them letters and meet with them. But he did leave, so that you can understand would upset some people. That it seems like when the going got tough, you split. But at the same time, he was trying to weigh that. Do I stick it out for them, or do I stay, or do I stay and be caught and killed, and then what good does that do anyone? So whatever you think of what he did, that is what he did. He came back, and his view was kind of in between. Rather than saying, yes, there's a process, you can come in, or no, you can't come in at all, he said, when somebody's about to die, they're on their deathbed, okay, now, you've said you want to be back in the church, you can't come back in the church, but when you're on your deathbed, we'll go and accept you back in, and then you're okay. So it would require some planning. But
it's like make them sweat it for.
Can I ask a really specific
yeah,
question?
sweat it out. Yeah.
Where do they come up with this? I mean, their ideas.
Every one of these can actually be supported with Scripture if you pick and choose. I mean, and these were not just arbitrary views. They were. I mean, there are passages where you can look at. If you deny me, then I'll deny you. Okay, well then you're with Novatian. There's others that talk about grace and mercy. Well, that sounds a whole lot more like Cornelius. So this is why the whole view of Scripture is important, and I think there was a value of looking at history, because when you look at the papers, the letters back and forth between these people arguing their views, this is 2,000 years ago. People were battling this out and trying to come to what's the best way to divide this issue.
Well, now we just do it on Facebook, and things haven't really
There
changed.
you go. Right. I'll tell you, what has changed, though, is people have an idea today, and they think that they're brilliant because no one's thought of it before. That's the thing that's crazy. This has been debated a bunch of times by lots and lots of really smart people, and we're just going to dismiss all that. That's what's kind of funny. But so here's another consideration with the whole libellus issue is, so we've got these hall passes to get out of death free.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
During that period of time, was the Pope looked at like today, that what they declared was dogma?
No, not per se. The Catholic Church, the way that we think of it today, didn't exist then. Catholics would disagree, but
Right.
in the same sense we have now, it's a very different church back then.
How do you refer to someone as the Pope then, instead of himself as an anti-Pope?
Yeah.
Well, they're the Pope, but what Pope meant, I mean, Pope means father. So they're the father of the church. They're a leader of the church. It's a the pastor above the pastors.
When you refer to Pope at this time period, you're not referring to a single figure that's the head of the entire.
He was a single figure. Yep,
Is it more of a
the Bishop of
succession?
Rome.
Did you say something about a succession as opposed
Part of
to
it
being
has to do with succession.
appointed with the white and black smoke?
But how far back do Catholics? I mean, I know they say that. it
With
started
succession, they
with
they
Peter,
say they go back
but
to
how
Peter.
back can they really follow the Pope?
Oh, you can go back to
You
Peter.
can go right back
Sure.
to someone being a head of the entire church, all the
Well-
way back to Peter
Okay, as
in Rome.
you got to remember, when the church started, it started in Rome. I mean, it started in Jerusalem, but then when it
Right.
moved to Rome, when the seat of the church moved to Rome, because Jerusalem, basically that church ended.
Destroyed.
When it moved to Rome, that was where that was the head of the empire. So that's where it made sense that the head of the church would be as well, because that's where the seat of the population was, and many people came out from there. So that kind of made sense for that to be the center of the faith, as far as, that's where Peter was.
So
And
Rome was considered the center of the faith, starting about when?
probably, around 100, I guess, maybe before that. Because that's where the faith was, primarily. It was spread out. There were outposts all over the place, but just like they were used to receiving, the rulers in Rome, the emperor in Rome would issue their political pronouncements from Rome for the rest of the empire. It worked very similarly for Christianity. Keep in mind, though, when you're talking about defining the Pope, it means father, basically.
Yeah.
So, and they do have, if you want to look, we can track back apostolic succession, if you think that's important. But they can track that, and I don't have a problem with that. It's when you start talking about speaking ex cathedra, which I think you were talking about, that's not a terribly old thing. A lot of other things that go in with being a pope, we'll cover some of those as we hit them through history, but they were not part of the system at this point. And even the ex cathedra thing, it's surprising how few times that's been exercised. Probably on one hand, you can count the number of times that's been exercised. So, some people have the view that anything the Pope says, he's infallible. That's not the view. The view is when he is speaking as Pope on behalf of the Church on matters of doctrine, which they do take very seriously. So, it's an interesting issue, but for quite a while, when we're talking about the Catholic Church, it's primarily little c, which means the United Church, the church of all churches united. Now, we'll talk about when it starts to become the Roman Catholic Church, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute too, and what the differences are. So the issue here with the libellus, the big issue is, did the lapsed person actually sacrifice? Or, another thing that's happening is they would go, hey, my brother-in-law's got a friend who's a centurion, and he'll sell you a libellus. So you don't have to sacrifice, but you've got the papers. Well, is that good or bad? So you haven't sacrificed, fine, but you've bought a paper saying you have, and you're telling everyone you have, so is it any better? Probably, but not a lot. You're a little less dirty than this guy, but you're still dirty. It's a weird thing to try and figure out, but that was one thing that they looked at. When they're trying to figure out not only what to do with the lapsed, but how did they lapse, and what all did they do as far as how to deal with them. For whatever reason, historically, just for historical, the consensus went with Cornelius, and I think it does stay that way today. And many churches have that codified in their their bylaws, whatever. If somebody in the church is accused of, or is found to be guilty of some moral failing, or leaves the church, whatever, they want to come back, many churches have it actually in their rules. This is a process you go through. It takes this long. These are the things you have to do. So that's kind of historically, the church has gone with Cornelius's view. Yeah.
Just so I understand the term lapse, what is, I guess better to just ask you to define it. I don't understand. Is it people, they see people who have sinned and everybody else doesn't sin?
No, it's not about sin. It's about saying to the Roman officials, I hereby renounce my Christianity.
Did they call it Christianity back then?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they say the view that I hold about Jesus Christ, for the stability of the empire, I'll set that aside and renounce it. And I hereby, they're doing it in front of an official, like going to, get a ticket taken care of or something, where you and the official sign it. And we have a number of these actually that have been found. And I think I put a translation of one that was found in there, so you can see what they actually were agreeing to.
It looks like the most forgeable piece of paper I've ever seen. It's just like a post-it note, sure.
I know.
They're a little kid.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the Decian persecution, 3 years of Decius. And then we've got another break in the storm of several decades where things were relatively quiet. During this time, a guy named Anthony, whatever, in the year 270, he made a name for himself because he's born to a wealthy family. He reads about Jesus and the things that he taught about leaving everything behind, giving everything to the poor, whatever. Looks like it though, doesn't it? He was born to a wealthy family. He reads these words, gives everything away that he has, and goes out to live in the desert. And he has a cloak and his sandals, and that's it. There had been monks before that, but he kind of forged a new path of monasticism, what's called an ascetic lifestyle, meaning you're denying everything. Your money, belongings. They couldn't. Nothing could belong to them. It was very, rejecting everything material, and went to live in the desert. So that was something that started off around then, 270.
Aesthetic, that means somebody who lives without want or without things.
Yeah, it's a denial. No, not aesthetic.
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 People
I
like,
knew I didn't hear it right, something
they're
with
considered,
computing.
Ascetic. This is ascetic.
It sounds like ethics.
Not-
I know, that wasn't working.
Not this.
Yeah.
yeah. And they don't even actually have food. People bring them food and feed them. They clothe them. They bring them anything that they need to survive. They
Like
just do not have
I know
stuff.
what it is.
No, it's like the,
Sorry.
the beauty of something,
Right.
like quality.
I'm gonna add more comedians.
So, in 284, the next bad D guy comes along, Diocletian. Diocletian starts in 284, and he sets up. He thinks he's going to be real clever. If you look at Roman history, the emperor system, it was very easy to be toppled and whatever. So what he did, he thought he would find a way to stay in power. So he split the system up into 4 emperors. So you got 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, and they each have a different region. And supposedly it's going to make things more stable. It didn't work out real well, but that was his idea. So Diocletian, there's a problem that started under Diocletian's reign. He didn't start out to be a real bad guy concerning Christians. What he did, or what happened is, he tried to build this army. So you've got these 4 different emperors, and each has a standing army in these different regions. There were already some Christians in the army, but Christianity is spreading like crazy, especially with this martyrdom, that people are taking this seriously. Why are people dying for this? So now you're getting people inside the army being saved. So now you got Christians in the army, which makes it very confusing. What do we do when we find a Christian? Because some of them inside the group are Christians. So and then that also raised some issues for the church. The church, and still today we have groups that are very pacifistic, and we have others that talk about just war, and others have no problem with dominance. So what do you do with that? Should a Christian serve in the military? That's a whole different issue that was discussed a lot then. Most church leaders said no, because they didn't have a real great view of what the Romans were doing overall. But anyway, Christianity spreading, so we have a number of Christians in the ranks of the army. Galerius, which is one of these junior emperors, he convinced Diocletian that having Christians in service was a threat because they might leave, or if they were ordered to do something that violated their faith, they might disobey it, which that part anyway is probably a possibility. But Galerius convinced them, so Diocletian said, okay, let's send the Christians home. Tell them they're dismissed, thanks for serving, nothing wrong, you're not in trouble, it's not a without honors kind of thing, but they were dismissed, just to kind of simplify things. That worked in most places. Galerius didn't like the solution. It wasn't as sweeping as he'd like. But he was also worried about how badly his troops might be thinned out, because he had a lot of Christians in his ranks. So if we lose all these Christians, then I'm not going to have a very big army. So his solution was to order all Christians in service either recant or die. Well, that was a little more serious. That's not quite what Diocletian had in mind. That was Galerius' solution. This resulted in a number of executions. A whole bunch of Christians in the service were executed. This did not go over well. Christians didn't like it. It forced Diocletian to make some decisions he didn't want to make. He was thinking his solution of just letting them go home peacefully would work, and it might have if they hadn't executed so many. So now Diocletian starts to get paranoid that Christians are conspiring against him. That these Christians, because we just wholesale slaughtered a bunch of them, that maybe they're all planning, to overthrow me. And he's just set up this whole system of 4 guys to try and bring stability. So now he's thinking he's going to have something uprising from within. So what are we going to do about that? So he then says, because he's sure that they're all conspiring against him, which I don't know that we have the evidence that they were, but he's convinced of it. So he orders all church leaders to be arrested, and he reinstituted a system similar to Decius with the libellum, and to try and encourage Christians to leave their faith. Now, we've had 50 years of relative peace here, several decades, maybe not quite 50. That's a long time. It's long enough for people to not be familiar with how things used to be. They've had an easy life. They're not as familiar with the martyrs. They're not as familiar with the persecution the church has gone through. They see this not really a new thing, but as far as they're concerned, it's a new thing coming in. So many actually did recant during this period. Diocletian's persecution was the worst period the church had to endure. Lots and lots of people crucified and just horrible stuff done to them. In 305, Galerius convinced Diocletian to abdicate the throne. Galerius continued the persecutions. And during that time, Galerius gets ill with a painful disease. I don't know. I should have looked at what you have for slides. That's fine. You can leave that there. Yep. That's coming up in a bit, but it's a nice picture. So Galerius gets ill with this painful disease, and maybe he thought that the Christian God sent it, and who knows, whether he did or not, what happened. But he shocked everybody by changing his policy. This is the guy that ordered all the Christians under his command to be killed. So he said, okay, all Christians are off the hook. Everything's fine, And in 311, he lifted all the bans on Christianity and pled with Christians to pray to their God for prosperity and peace of Rome. It's like, you guys keep on switching, pick something and stick with it, but you're just going with whatever seems to suit you. It's kind of funny, too, that not too long ago they're saying, we're not having prosperous times because you're not worshiping our gods, but now they're saying, we're not having prosperous times, why don't you worship your God and pray to him, and maybe that will help us. So I don't think Galerius changed his mind a whole lot. I think he was self-serving, but it's an interesting twist there. So at that point, 311, Christianity is now legal. The prisons are emptied. All these people who have been beaten for a long time now are let out. Doors are open, they're let go. So now, you've got people coming home, and among these, many of them are clergy. Okay, they're arresting people, except for people like I mentioned, Cyprian. He went into hiding to avoid this, but others didn't, so they got arrested. So you can imagine the issue we talked about with people getting libellum, the lapsed, these people who would recant their faith. It's bad enough when somebody in the church does it, but what do you do if your pastor, the guy that's in charge of everything, he did that? Well, that seems like a bigger deal, So then they're trying to decide what to do with this. Of these people, some did deny Christ, but many did not. And the ones who, and many who did, also turned over scriptures. So Diocletian comes around. One of the things he did was to demand that they turn over any scriptures they had. So they did, and they burned them. So what do you do if your guy, even if he didn't lapse, he turned over the scriptures that the church had been holding, for a couple 100 years now, and they're burned now and lost? Well, they didn't like that. So they're trying to decide what to do with them. So we had something similar to the Novatian schism, what ended up being called the Donatist schism. This is when a similar principle, but it's to do with the leaders of churches. Shouldn't they be treated more harshly than the average pew warmer? You know, what do we do with these guys? So Donatus said, not only should they be expelled, but that any sacraments, so if they've issued communion to someone, if they've baptized someone at the end of the catechesis, excuse me, anyone who had been baptized by them or had received communion from them, it was invalid. So all those communions you received were gone. And if you're baptized by one of these guys, you're not a Christian because his baptism didn't have any value because who knows about his faith anyway because he lapsed.
How does that go for people that have died?
A good question. I don't know.
Was there like a recall slip that was issued out to people who had been baptized?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You need to come back in
Right.
and re-baptized.
Get forward.
Well, the thing is, that was Donatus' position. The majority of the church rejected this. They said that's just silly. I mean, communion is a sacrament of Christ. These people who are offering it, they're just acting on behalf of Christ. This is not, just because they did it. Of course, all humans are flawed. All humans sin. This is silly. So the majority of the church rejected that. Donatus, people who followed him, it was the Donatist schism, and people followed him, and they have their own church. Another church split here. The vast majority rejected that, though. But just a historical note, that did happen. And church splits are not a new thing. Yeah, Gary?
When we talk about the sacrament, receiving the sacrament, had the Roman Catholic doctrine of the sacrament taken effect this time, so that you're actually receiving your salvation through the continual sacrifice of
don't
Christ?
confuse terms, though. It's a sacrament, but it's not like transubstantiation. That's a relatively new concept. They didn't hold to that back then.
So maybe we look at it as just in memory of it's not.
Correct.
Really
I think that's probably the majority view then. I think that's how most understood
Why
it.
would that have anything to do with whether you were a Christian or not? I can see the baptism, but I don't see the being given the sacrament.
I think what they're saying is anything that they had done, that they had facilitated, just was gone because it had no meaning because they weren't acting on behalf of Christ. Like I said, this was not a whole lot of people held to this, but it's just a kind of a historical note that it did happen. Okay, so this freedom is good news for Christians, but this Diocletian system is still in place. Galerius is the most powerful of these 4 emperors. He's still the most powerful, but there are these other emperors in place. One of them is named Maxentius, and he began to renew the persecution. The other, Galerius is on his deathbed, essentially. The other 2 kind of stayed out of it. Maxentius decides he wants to start the persecution. Galerius gets ticked off because, no, I said we're going to stop this now, and he wants to get well. So if one of the 4 is doing this, he wants to make sure we're all on the same team. So Diocletian's 4-emperor system is not working out as well as they hoped. So he decided, one of the 3 was a quiet guy at the time that you've probably heard of now, named Constantine. And there's all kinds of crazy urban legends about Constantine. But we'll go through some of what Constantine actually did. So far, he's kind of flown under the radar. He's one of the quiet guys. For some reason, and I don't know if anyone is really sure why, he decided to take up the cause. This persecution shouldn't keep happening. Maxentius needs to be squashed. We need to put this down. So he went after Maxentius, one of his co-emperors. He decides to sneak in and wipe him out. The night before battle, Constantine has a dream where he's told to put the labarum on his shields. Other people call it the Chi Rho. It's that symbol there. And Chi Rho are the first 2 letters of Christ in Greek. So you'll see Chi Rho or labarum. When you put it together as a symbol like that, it's called a labarum. He sees this, and this is a story. He sees this in a vision, in a dream, and if you do this, you'll have victory. Now, he worshipped the god of the sun prior to that point. Some people think he became a Christian then. I think that's highly overrated. I don't think he really did. But so he tells everybody, paint this on your shields, and they do. They all paint this symbol on their shields. So now, not only is Maxentius surprised by these people coming over the hill, the guy's on his side coming over to attack him, but they've all got this new thing painted on their shield. What are they doing? So he got a little worried. What's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 313, Maxentius and persecution were ended at that point. So now, I'm sorry, that was 311, I believe. 313, he signed the Edict of Milan, Constantine did, which declared Christianity religio licita, which just means legal religion. So it was legally, now on the books, Christianity is legal. That doesn't mean all persecution ended, but it's a notable time because that's when it was put on the books. This is no longer illegal. And another thing Constantine did is said, okay, anybody that's been put in jail that hasn't been released needs to be let out, which most of them have been under Galerius. And then any seized property, when we took your land and your church and all the gold, whatever, you know, the relics and things that were in it, give it all back, because it's the state has no say to it. So they let that all back. So 311 is actually the more notable time as far as persecution ending because of what Galerius decided. But many people point to 313 because of the Edict of Milan and what Constantine did. And as I mentioned, people will say Constantine converted Christianity because he won this battle. That's when he became very friendly to Christianity, but he didn't, I don't think that he converted. I mean, there's a lot of odd things that happened in Constantine's life after that.
So the story that he had his troops all baptized.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But he still, you can still find all kinds of reference to him talking about the sun god, and that was his main god. So I think he kind of took on Jesus as another one of these gods in the pantheon, and he may have converted to Christianity later, but I don't think at this point. Something else I'm going to cover too that we touched on a little bit. It'll take a while before we get to the Roman Catholic Church in the sense that we know of it today. So as I mentioned, we're talking about the Catholic Church, primarily the small c. This was not an official church at the time. But you can see, we've already had the Novatian Schism, the Donatist Schism. So you see, as things are coming out, especially with legalization, which is a funny view, but I think what Constantine does was kind of bad in a way. Whenever there's persecution, not that it ought to be the degree he was doing, but whenever Christianity's been out of favor, it thrives. I mean, look today in other countries, Christianity, communism, it thrives in all these other places. Wherever it's the culturally popular thing to do or acceptable or whatever, it's a very watered down and thin thing. So you see, not only with the Novatian Schism, the Donatist Schism, you see other things happening where, as things split more, that's where the Roman Catholic Church kind of rises. And I'm actually sympathetic to when you see why it rises, and I'll go through some examples. There's certainly doctrines that Protestants will disagree with, but what I respect is when you look and see where did these things come from. They didn't just have a meeting and say, let's come up with a bunch of ideas that are outrageous or whatever, that we think this is what Christianity is, and we'll just proceed from here. These all came from a place, and most of them came from, I think, a good place. They were responding to something that needed a response. Some of them, you might have disagreed with their response at the time, but I think probably not a lot of them. I think most of them, you probably agree with their response at the time. You go over the centuries, you go, this has been taken way in a different way than it was intended. So I'll go through a few examples here. So to see where I jotted those down. Okay. Doctrines and practices, I kind of mentioned this. They didn't just arise as an arbitrary thing. They came up with reasons to do them. So looking back at the lapsed, what do we do with these lapsed people that have left the faith? You know, you can at least sympathize with the idea that there should be some sort of consequence and some sort of judgment where that range is and at what point they've fulfilled it. You know, that's kind of a position where there's some disagreement. But what do we do with these people who are lapsed? What do we do with the people who are in that position? How do you balance consequences and justice with reconciliation and mercy and those kind of things? Now, today, well, at the time then, you know, they talked about these people as penitents that were seeking restitution. So they came up with a system whereby you seek penance, okay? So penance is a way to show your contrition. So, okay, you left the faith. How do we know you're really a Christian now? So maybe it includes being rebaptized. Maybe it includes a period of time where you're sitting in the back and illustrating that you really do believe these things, or whatever it is. This is a system of penance. Now, it's a very different thing now, and it's a different process now, but you can understand their they're trying to find a way to, at least to the best of their ability, establish that these people are sincere. And I think that's a commendable thing. Like, it's a good thing to be looking for. You know, the Bible does talk about, you'll know they're Christians by their love and the fruits of the Spirit, these kind of things. Well, if you're looking for these different fruits, that's kind of the penance system in this original, in this the early days. Yeah, okay.
2 questions. First, I'm guessing the answer is so that they don't put them in a position of teaching when they're not real, when it's not authentic. But why do they care?
Why does who care what?
Why does the church care to humiliate somebody, in essence, enough as to whether or not my penance is real? And second, probably it's probably connected, is did they not back then look to what God would want? Because rules don't really make me a Christian. Following a set of standards don't make me a Christian.
Well, these aren't rules, and I don't think humiliation ever entered into it. I think it's easy to see it that way, but that was not the goal. The goal, I mean, imagine
even if it's not, why do they care? Why do they care why would you as the pastor care whether my penance is real?
If
I
pastor's,
hope that makes sense.
yeah, but if a pastor's goal, if their job is to shepherd a flock and to guide them and lead them, and if you're supposed to be, you know, mentoring them, teaching them, and all these kind of things, you know, you never know what somebody's thinking or doing in their private life.
Exactly.
But what do you do when somebody in the public openly flouts everything that you believe, and then comes back in and says, "Yeah, I'm just one of them"? I think you got to deal with that. I mean, I would. It doesn't seem like humiliation to me. It seems like something that ought to be dealt with somehow, especially for those who are in some position of leadership. You know, you can't just say, "Yeah, come and go as you please." If that's the case, what does Christianity mean? I mean, it feels like we need to have some kind of set of beliefs and
It
practices.
wasn't just the person who did this involved, it's everybody else who's viewing it too. Like,
Yeah.
do you
Who's
just
lost?
turn a blind eye
Yeah.
to, you know, a guy in this position who denounced Christianity and wants to come back? So I think that's wise
Sure.
because it was public. And
Absolutely.
And I think they took their faith a lot more seriously than we
Right.
do.
Absolutely.
And if we look back at the New Testament, you find in Paul's instructions on church discipline
Oh yeah,
that, you know, they dismiss people from the church.
sure. Yep. And
Eat with them, didn't
Wouldn't
spend
eat with
time
them.
with them.
yeah.
All of that's
Especially
fine and dandy, but
authority.
none of that determines whether or not I go to heaven.
Well, we're not talking about that though.
None of that does.
Right.
What
I don't
we're
think
talking
we're
about is
saying-
whether or not you have fellowship with the saints.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And don't you think, too,
Fellowship
that
with
they've
the what,
just
I'm
gone
sorry?
through
With the church, with the saints.
all this persecution, I mean, maybe this is a plant coming in to try to get some stuff
Right.
on it. And yet,
Sure.
I remember think that there'd be some protection there that they
Absolutely.
needed, and assurance this person is truly
Yeah.
repentant and wants to make that public statement.
Yeah, and even though Christianity was legalized, it was still,
Sure.
there was still persecution, but, you know,
And it flips
overzealous
back and
people.
forth,
Yeah,
so,
you never know.
Yeah.
Just a few other quick things, just on these early things that later become different things in the Roman Catholic Church. You know, I've talked about these 2 big church splits that happened right off the bat. Well, what do you do with that? What do you do with a church split? When people leave the church, does it mean anything? If you have to go ahead, I'll try and wrap up. If somebody leaves the church, are they still Christians? I mean, this had never been discussed. Jesus didn't talk about this. I mean, there are things we can point to for sure, but he never said if people leave your organized church because of this reason, that they're Christians but they're not part of the church, or they're part of the church but they don't go to heaven. I mean, what do you do with this? So this was the first time they ever thought this through. So they had to start talking about things like, can you leave the church and still be a Christian? Can you start a new denomination? When Donatus goes and starts his own thing, is that okay? It's one thing if you've got a church, I mean today, looking back, if you've got a church that they believe that you only have organs and no electric guitars. Okay, well, that's kind of innocuous, whatever. But then you've got other churches like Donatus, well, that's a kind of a big deal, you know, that there's a big difference there. Or some of these heresies, Arians. Well, that's not Christianity. So we do have to, it's real easy to see the extreme ends of a line, but where is the midpoint, and how do we figure that out? A lot of that's being figured out. And like you're saying, Gary, with Paul's instructions, this is the beginning of excommunication. Now, it's become a different thing now, but the idea was, if somebody isn't a Christian anymore, and they claim that they are, but they're living in denial of everything it means to be a Christian, well, we got to say something, and we got to tell them, you can call yourself what you want, but you're not a Christian. That's excommunication. That's the beginning of it. So, we see it now with, in the Roman Catholic context in terms of divorce and remarriage and things like that. And, that's a very different thing. It took a long time to develop, for better or worse, but that's where it started. We have the examples of the lapsed, but also those who didn't. Remember, Galerius opens the prisons, and all these guys come out. Many of them, I said, were church leaders. Church leaders, they may not have killed them. Look at John, boiled in oil. You got people that are whipped and stoned, and maybe they tried to kill them. They got chunks of animals taken out of them. They didn't die, and they're still working away at them. I mentioned Blandina and stuff last time that it took days to kill. Well, you got these people that are released from prison now, who they didn't finish killing. Imagine, these are not people who are just, you see the, what's the, Mel Gibson's Passion. You see what Jesus looked like in that, okay? This is what these people coming out of jail looked like. Imagine standing in a pew next to a guy that looks like that. This is a reminder that it's ugly, what's happening. So what do you do with these kind of things? So, these people, you imagine you got that guy in your church, he's somebody that everybody looks up to. It's like, yeah, not worshiping him, but it's like, you went through a lot. This is a serious thing. They have a place of honor, which they deserve, I think. These people were called saints, for good reason, I think. So you hear about veneration of the saints, you still hear that phrase today. All it meant is, these guys deserve recognition. They went through a lot. Look, they probably would have preferred to have died by this point. So I think that veneration of the saints is perfectly appropriate. Now, what we do now and praying to them and all that, now you can, even prayer to the saints, think in terms of, man, I'm suffering, and gosh, I remember Polycarp. I remember sitting in the pews next to him. He was such an inspiration. You can imagine somebody asking Polycarp to help him, to go through that kind of thing, to help me to, I want to be like you, Polycarp. And maybe it's an informal thing or whatever. Not that I'm advocating it, but you can understand where that would come from if you're living and breathing that air, That's where these things come from. So one thing I've really appreciated going through this stuff is I see where these things come from. Now this practice makes a lot of sense to me, and I can respect it. I think it's gone in a different direction, but I respect what they were doing, what they're trying to do. So I will leave it there, and we'll continue next week.